It's an honour to be here at the Constitutional Club back in Burton, celebrating Samuel Allsopp's famous teapot brew of 200 years ago. But being in such learned company, many of you have written books about the subject, I thought you'd be best served in me talking about something I have unique knowledge about, which is bringing Allsopp's back rather than the history of IPA or family breweries or things like that. So I'm going to discuss untangling all the labels, the advertising, and 300 years of logos and funny red hands that we had, and making a coherent brand design for Allsopp's. So I'm just going to start from where it all began, just down the road with my 9 times great-grandfather, Benjamin Wilson, who was brewing at the Blue Stoops. As Ian says, although in all the advertising that we had and the labels that I used and the labels that were used, that says, and the front page of this presentation says Allsopp since 1730, he actually started brewing in 1742. So thanks, Ian. So in 1742 we started, but he was still my 9 times great-grandfather, and Samuel Allsopp took over the brewery, as Ian said earlier, in 1806, but at that point Napoleon Bonaparte had blockaded the Baltic trade routes, and the brewery sort of entered the doldrums, and sales faltered. And this was the case until 1822, when the East India Company, Campbell Marchbanks, came and said, could you brew this beer? And Samuel Allsopp and Job Goodhead, his maltster, brewed the first Burton IPA in a teapot. And then we had sort of other glorious successes, apart from, the export business. We sent beer to the Arctic in 1851. We brewed Arctic Ale, and a few other, great, the first beer laboratory in 1845 and such things. But in 1896, Percy had the great idea. Percy Allsopp, my 4 times great-grandfather, decided to educate himself about lagering, and travelled around Germany and designed a lager brewery, a very, very large lager brewery in New York, and shipped it back. Apparently it was the largest in England at the time, but he was very, very early, and timing's everything, and that was the first sort of nail in the coffin for Allsopp's. We had his brother Samuel IPO'd the company on the public markets, and that didn't go particularly well as our ale sales. So from huge successes, there's a few catastrophic failures, and our name was taken off the bars in 1959. My interest in Allsopp started when I was about 8 years old. I'd learned of this sort of legend that we had a big brewery on the Trent, and Allsopp's were always brewers. And I wrote to the breweries and received beer labels and beer towels and made things of those. And at sort of a prep school, my wall was covered in beer mats and things like that. But fast forward 3 decades, I'd started collecting the trademarks of Allsopp's, from Carlsberg, from Brewdog had one, and they were scattered around the place. And I started to consolidate this group of Allsopp's trademarks. And it looked like at that point that I had enough to give it a go, and try and relaunch Allsopp's beer. So we test brewed in 2019, 2020, into a global pandemic, and then inflation, and then a recession. So in Allsopp style, and now the computer's broken, that button. So it wasn't going to be easy for Allsopp's back, but I didn't think it'd be quite like this. What we did is we got 300 years of labels and advertising. Well, not quite 300, but as much as we could get. And we're confronted by this. It was very difficult to make head or tail of a system that Allsopp used. Even the spelling, the signatures, there was no real colour. The only consistent thing was the red hand, as you can see. So we went and split them out and sort of chose my favourite really, and got the most popular labels. And a system became evident of the red hand central in the racetrack, and the hierarchy of Allsops and then the beer type below. And from there, we narrowed it down to 3. And all of them have their quirks. You know, this one, which I think is sort of one of the smartest, it was a late label, George IV, you know, so he ruled over a pretty turbulent time in British history, but also a very turbulent time of Allsops at this point. And you can see that it's very elaborate, although it says Allsop rather than Allsops. It has the royal warrant at the top and a very elaborate 6-ring racetrack. If we go on to the next one. And then this Arctic Ale label I find interesting because that's sort of lovely, bottled expressly for Arctic use, which appeared on a few of the other labels. They were specific for bottled for home consumption, they said on some of them. So we took that, and then this one I loved, which just showed that the prominent red hand at the front of the labelling. And so from those 3, we had a kind of an idea of where we wanted to take this, you know, this back catalogue of hundreds of years of labels and advertising, and which direction we wanted to go with it. But the hands weren't really suitable for modern labels. As you go on to the next, I mean, some of them, I don't think the modern drinker would like some of those, that left-hand one maybe. So what we did is redrew them, retaining the cuff, and this one on the left is the larger one that we stippled. So I sent it off, commissioned an artist to redraw the right hand, and that one's for crown caps and keg caps, and this is for, you know, sort of, you know, our letterheads and advertising and things like that. So so essentially what I'm trying to say, we've kind of, the attention to detail, we've taken the whole lot and then reimagined it and redrawn everything, and I'll go into some more details. The next slide, please. So, and this was Samuel's signature, of which I've seen my first real signature just before I got on before this talk, which is really exciting because I hadn't actually seen his writing firsthand before. So this was these are the various signatures on the labels, and in order to get in a sort of coherent form, I sent it to a type font artist who redrew it and came up with a Samuel Allsopp and Sons signature. And then the strange, next slide please, and then this surprised me a great deal, is the hundreds of fonts that were used. And so we isolated all the fonts, took them out, and then sort of, to use a technical term, squashed them, as it were, to straighten them up. But what we then found is all of these fonts have a slight optical illusion in that the top is thicker, so to make it look straight, but when it's on a curve, they were very clever with how they made the fonts look uniform. And so we then redrew those fonts. And this is the call to action, which needed no changing. So ask for Allsops, always ask for Allsops was another one they used, which I hope you do. But this is the resulting typeface, and we created the typeface from all the Allsops labels. And so we now have a typeface that we think we can use for what we use now for everything. And the next step was choosing all the colours from all of those hundreds of labels. And once again, there was no coherent colour code to anything apart from the red hand. It was sort of a free-for-all, like, you know, independent. Well, the one thing that was the same usually was the Pilsner had a yellow, but that was a later Pilsner. The wee yellow can was the Allsops Pilsner. But the rest of the beers swapped and changed. So we then sort of created a set of rules so that the red is the red hand, the blue, the pale ale, the green is the IPA. You can see our sort of core IPA here, yellow, the Pilsner. And this is a summary of sort of all the work that we did. It took quite a lot, really quite a lot of time, actually, you know, 12 months, to get everything together, to go through that back catalogue of wonderful advertising that we have, create sort of modern photography, and bring an old brand that was, you know, looked pretty old, and modernized it for the sort of modern drinker. So, and that's the result, the 3 beers that we currently have. You can see we have the racetrack, the Allsops going along the middle, and the subcategory below it. And then along the top, brewed for home consumption, and established Burton on Trent, we can't yet, sadly, I'm afraid, say brewed in Burton-on-Trent, but we'll see. Work in progress. And then this is the for the commercial for the commemoration India Pale Ale that we have brewed and we're drinking now. We're still a small company, so we couldn't get this out this year. But I've got the designs for, I think, a really smart bottle. I'll take you through how we did that. And we have our test brew here. But we took this old IPA label that I showed you before and made a few changes to this. So it's a sort of more direct link to the past because it was a 200th-year commemoration ale. Go to the next one, please. So here, we lost our royal warrant. So I went into the archives and went to the Kenyan branch of Allsopp's brewery and took the lion and stuck a little crown on it and put that in the middle rather than putting our royal warrant in there. Retained the established 1730 and Burton-on-Trent and a 200-year. But I think, if you can, the next slide, it does look pretty similar to the old label, although it probably 201 when we release it, but hopefully maybe not this year. And then we had fun with the neck label. We had a bottle stopper that we used, and next slide, please. And we stuck the teapot in it. Ian, pleased to see. Thank you for doing that. So celebrating 200 glorious years of Allsopp's famous India Pale Ale, and that's now the neck label. And again, we had the teapot drawn and had it stippled. So it's a real shame that we couldn't release it in time. And then this is the final result. Is the bottle with a tap, and on the back there's a quote that's not quite right here, but it was described as mellow as an aged Madeira and as nourishing as a beefsteak, I think in 1854. And so I put that on the back because it's a pretty good description of a beer. And it's 7.4% rather than 11 there. But that is what I'm hoping to bring out with the neck label. Wax top, I don't know, but I hope you like the look of it. And then we're having so much fun, we did another one, which I think looks great. So that will probably have 202 years on it. But we plan on releasing these in the future. And there's an Arctic Ale in there as well. We did that. This is the lineup of the core beers and our specials. We plan on we have the Arctic Ale recipe. And we plan on, again, releasing that in time. But we design that as well. But all of that is pretty relevant without liquid. And here is the ledger. It took about 18 months to find a recipe for Allsopp's. My family have lost pretty much everything, all our brewing records, apart from some mirrors and jugs that we had in the house. And the message that I had from everyone is do this as authentically as you possibly can. And we have tried to do everything as authentically as we can. Obviously, we're not brewing at Burton, but we are a startup, an old startup. But I rang many people to try and find a ledger. And after 12 to 18 months, I had a call that Steve Holt at Kirkstall had the old recipe book. And I drove straight up there, and it was exactly what I wanted to look like. It was a big, leather-bound, beaten-up old book with 250 recipes in it. And I sent that to Jim, who's just about to tell you about brewing it. And we are working our way through those recipes to brew Allsopp's beers as best we can. And this is the commemoration beer that we're here to taste today. So thank you very much for listening, and over to you, Jim.
It's probably a stupid question. Why was that red hand?
Good question. So the story that I give is that on the side of inns, when inns had fresh beer, they put a hand outside to signify there's fresh beer for travellers going in so they had something to drink. And my family used a hand, but it wasn't red. I've seen an example again, first time today, of a black hand and a pink, purple hand, and there was an engraved hand, I know. And I think, my suspicion is, and I don't know this because I haven't read it, but I think probably, and I'll be told after saying this, I think by a few people probably, but my suspicion is that when Bass got the red triangle, my family thought, oh my God, that's brilliant, modern, and they made the hand red, I think is what happened. Something like that,
Okay.
because it wasn't it wasn't red before that, I don't think. There was a black hand, and all kind of different coloured hands. So I don't exactly know when it went red, but that's what I think it might be. I'd be told that I'm wrong, I'm sure, in about half an hour. Thanks for the question.
Sorry, guys, can you just switch the mic over? Just click that.
Yep, cheers. Okay, well, thank you very much for entertaining us today, and thanks again to the Con Club for putting us up at short notice. My name's Jim Appleby. I've started my brewing career with Bass back in 1989. I worked for them for about, well, a long time, let's say. I was taught by some greats, these two gentlemen sitting at the front here. But it was such an honour when Jamie came and asked me if I could help them try and decipher some of the information from this ledger. He told me he was going to relaunch Allsopp's. My initial reaction was, are you mad? But then he talked me through it, and the passion and the desire to make this work from Jamie was just infectious. So I was fully on board from day one. When you go through the ledger, it's massively complicated. It's full of recipes, but some of them are repeat recipes. But trying to decipher it was a big challenge, a really big challenge. We had some help along the way, but we've launched 3 beers so far. The Pilsner wasn't obviously in the ledger because that came a little bit later, but our standard IPA, if you like, was based on the information we found in the ledger, as was the Pale Ale. The Celebration Ale was a little bit more tricky. There was some pointers towards what that should look like. We did some research with the ledger, but also we wanted to produce a beer that went back a little bit further than this ledger. So this ledger was the 30s, I think. So obviously the original IPA came in 1822. So we've kind of used the ledger not as a direct recipe book, but for inspiration, really. So it was really, what were things like back in the day? I mean, the one thing I learned was, I think that at the time, certainly in the 1930s, according to the ledger, I think the guys were using materials they could get their hands on rather than having specific recipes. Materials were scarce. So it's, rather than directly taking the recipe from there, we've used it for inspiration and a knowledge of what an IPA, we believe, should look like. We know there's a lot of IPAs out there now. Got different styles, but they call themselves IPAs. But we tried to go back to a traditional IPA and something that we believe Samuel would have sent out to India back in 200 years ago. So just as a note, I know you've all tasted it now already, but we were going to talk you through it. But if you've got any comments, I've put some sheets on this snooker table. I think paper's all right on the snooker table, I believe. But if you've got any comments, if you want to write them down, I'd really appreciate any feedback, because this is a work in progress. We're still developing it. It's our first shot at it. I think we've done a reasonably good first go. So I think it's a good step in the right direction. We've tried to produce a traditional IPA, so we're looking for a strong beer. So you're looking at 7.5% ABV. So if anybody's driving, I wouldn't have more than 1. And if you're walking, I wouldn't have more than 3. We're looking for strong bitterness. We know that back in the day, the bitterness was high, and the reason for that is obviously it's got to stand the long journey out to India. So a high bitterness made it a lot more stable as a beer. What I found was, now you have IPAs, very strong hoppy aromas on them, but that wasn't really the case back in 200 years ago. So there is a nice aroma on it. I've tried to keep it a bit more subtle. So we actually used, I actually used Bramling Cross for the aroma with a little bit of Cascade. So Bramling Cross, very traditional Old English hop. I think very underrated in my opinion. I quite like it. So it's not big citrusy that you get on some of the IPAs you see around at the moment. It's more subtle. It's a little bit more slightly spicy, slightly hedgerow fruits more. So you're looking at sort of blackberries and things you find in the hedgerow. And that's just lifted a little bit with the Cascade hops that we added as well. So they do bring a little bit of citrus and a little bit more spice. So I hope you get that in the beer. So if you give it a swirl and have a smell, it's not in your face. It was never meant to be, but it's just a nice, subtle, mellow, fruity aroma. So then we came to the malts. We're using an ale malt and a pale ale malt. Again, we wanted to use heritage malts, and we know that Allsopp used a lot of Chevalier malt back in the day. It is available now. We've tried it. We've used it and we have it in some of the standard IPA and the pale ale. We use a little bit of Chevalier in there. We haven't got it in here because we couldn't get our hands on it at short notice for this brew, but the plan is to look at either Maris Otter, Chevalier, or some of the heritage malts going forward. So as I say, it's a work in progress, but I think it's a good start. So you're getting a lot of malt in there. It's 100% malt brew. It's very malty. There is quite a lot of sweetness left. It's still quite sweet, but this is a young IPA. It's only been brewed 3 weeks ago, I think, 3 weeks. So this is a very young IPA, and it's got to withstand this journey out to India. So we're going to come back to it in 4 months' time. And hopefully it'll have mellowed and the sweetness might have dropped a little bit as they go through this secondary conditioning. But I think it's a nice malt. The bitterness is high. We targeted 50 bitterness units, which is high. It's not as extreme as some of the American pale ales that you might find that really take the enamel off your teeth, but it's there. You can get it. It's robust bitterness, but it's quite rounded. So we used Fuggles and Challenger hops for this, which give a nice rounded bitterness. It's not too harsh. Again, a little bit of spice, a bit of grassy notes in the beer. So those hops just help to give us the bitterness we were looking for. We wanted it high, but not too in your face. And then, like I say, there's a little bit of sweetness there. So we've kept the actual final gravity quite high for what you class as a normal beer. So we've stopped the fermentation at 1013. I don't know what that is in Plato. I can't remember, Steve. Is it divide by 4, I think, for Plato? So you can do the maths. So it's 3 and a bit, maybe. But I don't know if you're dealing Plato. Anyway, 1013 is relatively high. I think that'll come down a little bit as it mellows and as it conditions. So it is quite sweet, but I think that kind of rounded sweetness that you're getting from the malt just helped balance the bitterness that's in there. We added crystal malt as well, which brings some caramel toffee notes to it. So I'm trying not to give away the whole recipe here, but it was a challenge. So I was honoured when Jamie came to me and said we wanted to do this. We had to do it in a bit of a hurry. It was a challenge, but we put it together, and I'm really pleased with the results personally. The water, we had to brew this in, we wanted to brew it in Burton. We spoke to a lot of the breweries here in Burton, and this is good news, they were all too busy to help us, unfortunately. But that's good news for these guys. Obviously it's a one-off, so it was a small-scale brew. So we brewed it down in Worcester, Spilsbury and Jones, a small brewery. Tony Jones I used to work with in Burton Brewery. He brewed it for me, and I think he's done a fantastic job. I scrounged some hops from another friend of mine for the aroma hops, which was good. So we kind of pulled it together last minute, short notice, but I think they've done a great job on the brewing. I think the recipe is kind of where we want to be, I think. I think we're moving in the right direction. As I say, it's not final maybe, but it's a step in the right direction. We've got a cask in the Coopers for those that are joining us later. And we have another one in the cellar of the Coopers, which we are looking to mature for the next 4 weeks. And Mandy from the Coopers, well, her partner anyway, has offered to rock it gently for the next 4 months to try and mimic time on the ship. I think we're going to have to put a storm in there at some point, so I'm going to have to get him to get a bit vigorous with it at some point. But the plan is to come back and try that in 4 or 5 months' time, probably in March next year. So I'm quite happy with it. I'm pleased with it. I think we're going in the right direction. It's kind of how I imagined an IPA might be 200 years ago. And as I say, I'd be really interested in any comments you've got on the sheets, if you can fill them out, if you feel obliged, if you feel like doing that. And I hope you all enjoyed it. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree. The glass lets it down. Yeah. Well, next time we'll have some Allsopp's glasses. But yeah. Yeah, I won't say anything about Doom Bars. I'll stop there. So enjoy the beer. Hopefully we'll see some of you or all of you in the Coopers later on to we can sit down and enjoy it properly. But
What plans have you got going forward for this beer?
for this one specifically, we're looking probably to launch it. I mean, we wanted to launch this year, but there just wasn't the time. It's not the right time to do that. So we're looking at maybe next year. Sorry? Bottle conditioned, yeah. We probably won't do it on draft, but I don't know. It's quite a strong beer to have on a cask, because you don't really want more than a half or two halves of it. It'll take time. So I don't know. It's definitely bottle conditioned next year. Yeah. Again, with the first two beers, the standard IPA and the pale, we wanted to do that bottle conditioned, but at the moment we just because we're small scale, it's just too complicated. So what we thought we'd have is the standard beers. So you've got the IPA, the pale, and the Pilsner, and then we'd look at specials that are bottle conditioned. So the Arctic Ale, we've been working on the recipe for that. That is going to be an even more challenging beer, and I'm looking forward to doing hopefully a trial brew for that next year and maybe launch that the year after. But that's an 11% beer, so that's a challenge. And when I look at some of the old recipes for the Arctic Ale, the final gravity was 1048. Which is where some beers start. So to get 11% and have a final gravity of 1048, you've got to start a long way up. Steve knows what I'm talking about, so you'd be humping a lot of malt around. Yes, sir.
Have you been able to access a local yeast at all?
We've been using a dried yeast, to be honest, because at the moment that matches our process, and it's called Trent Fermo, and it's based on Burton-on-Trent yeasts. Jamie found the Allsopp's yeast in the library, and we have done a trial brew with that. But it's to get it from the small cultures, get it grown up and into a brew, is complicated, very complicated. So at the moment we just don't have the scale to manage that. But that is the long-term plan, is to bring the Allsopp's yeast in as well when we have the right scale to do that. So and that's a Burton yeast. Yes, sir.